Welcome back. Let yourself grow still and let the day quietly slip away. Together, we'll drift gently toward the ancient question of where all things come from. If nights like this help, subscribe. There's a fresh one every evening. The Anaximander sat beside him, old in the way that certain teachers become old, not diminished, but settled, the way a large stone settles into the earth over many years until it is simply part of the ground. He was perhaps in his 70s, or near enough. Anaximander was young enough that his questions still arrived quickly, before he had learned to slow them down and turn them over in the way that Thilotha did, examining a question from many sides before deciding whether it deserved an answer or only more questions. Between them, on a day that left no record of its weather or its hour, something passed. A problem was placed into the air between one mind and another. It was not a new problem. It had been asking itself through priests and poets and navigators for as long as people had looked at the world and felt the need to understand it whole. But the Lolcapasts had managed to give it a shape, and Anaximander was learning to hold that shape with his hands and feel where the edges were. Miletus, in the early part of the 6th century before the Common Era, was a city that belonged to several worlds at once. It stood on the western coast of what is now Turkey, the Aegean at its feet, the long roads east stretching toward Persia and Babylon. Ships came and went through its harbor daily, cedar logs from the north, linen from Egypt, bronze goods cast in shapes that no Greek hand had made. The marketplace was a place where languages crossed and blended, where a merchant from Lydia might negotiate beside a craftsman from Corinth, where the smell of sea salt never fully left the air, even on windless afternoons. Miletus had grown prosperous enough and stable enough and open enough in its traffic with the wider world that certain of its citizens had the leisure to ask questions that had no immediate commercial value. The answers they sought could not be weighed or sold. They belonged to a different kind of accounting. They concerned what everything was made of, underneath the cedar and the linen and the bronze, underneath the ships themselves and the sea those ships moved across. The laws had proposed an answer. Water, he said. Everything is water. Not metaphorically, not poetically, but as a considered and serious claim about the substance that underlies the world in all its variety. The rock, the air, the living body, the fire at the center of any hearth. All of it, in his view, was water wearing different forms. This was not a claim he arrived at carelessly. It was an observation as much as a hypothesis. Water changes. It becomes vapor, then cloud, then rain, then river, then the moisture in a seed, then a plant, then food, then body, then eventually earth again. Of all the things a person could see around them in Miletus, water was the most evidently capable of transformation, the most comfortable in many different shapes. Thilot's had watched the world and drawn a line from what he saw to a first principle, a root cause, a beginning, and what he saw most clearly, most variously, most convincingly, was water. The claim itself was not the most important thing. What Thilot's had done that mattered was ask the question in a particular way. He had not said, the gods made everything from divine substance. He had not said, in the beginning, chaos gave birth to Gaia, and from Gaia came the generations of the world, as the poets who followed Hesiod had said for generations. He had said, look at what is actually here in the world as it moves and changes and persists, and ask what is most fundamentally what it is. What is its root? What is the one thing you cannot take away without everything else collapsing? This was the question he pressed into Anaximander's hands. In those long conversations, in a city full of foreign goods and the smell of the sea? What is the arche, the first principle, the original ground? Anaximander received the question. He turned it in his mind. He looked at Thales, this old man who had measured the height of the pyramids by observing the length of shadows, who had predicted an eclipse of the sun with enough accuracy to astonish the people around him, who had looked at the stars and thought he could see the geometry beneath them. Thales was not a man whose answer could be dismissed without cost. He had earned his water. He had followed the question honestly to where it led, and water had seemed to be waiting there. And yet Anaximander, sitting with the answer, began to feel something that students of serious thinkers have always felt when they are working with enough honesty to feel it. Not disagreement exactly, not yet, but a kind of mild resistance, the sense of a question not quite closed. The city continued its business around them. Sailors on the docks moved cedar planks from one place to another. A trader called out in a language that was not Greek. The harbor reflected the afternoon light in long, slow movement. Anaximander sat with the word water and felt that it did not quite hold everything he needed it to hold. The philosophical succession at Miletus was not a school in the formal sense that later institutions became, not a place with fixed walls and a recognized faculty and a syllabus. It was something older and less organized than that, more like a habit of attention passed from one person to another through sustained proximity. Thales seems to have gathered people around him, not because he sought followers, but because he was the kind of thinker whose presence makes others think. His questions had that quality. They were not closed, not purely rhetorical, not designed to demonstrate his own cleverness at the listener's expense. They were genuine. He seemed actually to want to know what everything was made of, and this genuine wanting was contagious. Anaximander caught it. He came to understand the question from the inside, and that inside knowledge was what allowed him, eventually, to feel where the edges of Thales' answer were. This was something new in the world, or something new at least in the documented world of Greek thought. The pattern of philosophical succession, a student inheriting a teacher's question, sitting with it long enough to find it insufficient, and offering a different answer, had not been written down before in this form. Hesiod had preceded Homer, and Homer had been read by everyone who read at all. But that was influence and imitation, not argument and revision. What happened at Miletus was something else. It was a thinker saying to his teacher, in effect, the question you asked is the right question, and I think your answer to it is not quite right, and here is a different answer, and you may notice that my answer is stranger than yours, harder to visualize, less tied to anything a hand can touch or an eye can follow in its daily transformations. This is not retreat from the difficulty. This is following the difficulty further than you were willing to go. Anaximander appears to have been a man of considerable practical intelligence, alongside his philosophical inclinations. Ancient tradition credits him with things that have nothing to do with first principles and limitless origins. He is said to have understood the geometry of the sky in a way that allowed him to mark the solstices and the equinoxes, to understand the movements of celestial bodies with enough precision to trace their patterns. He is said to have introduced into Greece the gnomon, the upright post whose shadow marks the hours. He is said to have drawn a map. These are the activities of a mind that was not content to stay in the philosophical abstractions of first principles, but wanted to understand the actual arrangement of the world, the practical geometry of where things were in relation to each other. The abstract and the practical lived in him together, and neither seemed to diminish the other. But the thing that gave him his place in the long record of the tradition was the philosophical question he had inherited and transformed. He took Thala's water and set it down, not because it was foolish, not because he had stopped respecting the old man who had offered it. He set it down because when he pressed on it, it gave way. An answer that gives way when pressed has not fully answered the question. Anaximander pressed, and water gave way, and what opened beneath it was something that could not be held in a cup, or seen in a harbor, or drawn up from a well. What opened beneath it was the question of what any determinate thing could be the first principle of. He had found the edge of Thale's answer by asking, if water is first, what is water? And if water has a nature, if it is wet, if it is cool, if it stands in opposition to fire, and to dryness, and to heat, then it already contains within it the assumption of a world in which these oppositions exist. It cannot be the ground of that world, and also one of the players within it. The ground cannot also be one of the pieces. This was Anaximander's philosophical step. It was not a small one. It looked small. It was just a shift in how the question was framed, a tightening of the standard of adequacy. But the shift in framing changed everything about what kind of answer could possibly satisfy the question. Where Thales had looked for the most basic known substance and found water, Anaximander required something that was not itself a substance within the world, something that did not already presuppose the world's basic divisions to be what it was. And when the question was framed that way, when the archer had to be something that stood before all the world's particular qualities rather than being one of them, no named thing could fill it, no thing a hand could hold. The origin, if there was one, would have to be beyond the reach of familiar description. Miletus, in the early part of the 6th century, was surrounded by intellectual activity of a kind that had few precedents in the documented past. Pythagoras was making his way eventually to southern Italy, where he would gather a community of people around the conviction that number was the key to the structure of the world. Heraclitus, in nearby Ephesus, was arriving at conclusions about the nature of change and opposition that would make him famous and famously difficult for 25 centuries afterward. Something was happening in the Aegean world in those generations, something that the tradition has always found difficult to fully explain, a collective willingness to press against the inherited explanations of the gods, to demand of the world an accounting that did not require divine persons with names and preferences and moods. The Homeric tradition had given the world a cosmology of extraordinary beauty and psychological richness. The gods were real presences with real relationships and real desires, and the world's events were the consequence of those desires meeting and clashing. This was not a lazy explanation. It was, in its way, a profound one, a recognition that the world is full of forces that exceed any individual's control, and that those forces have something like the character of persons. But Anaximander and those like him were pressing on a different point. They were asking not who made the world or who governs it, but what it is. What is the substance of it, the underlying nature, the thing that persists when all the various forms come and go? And to ask that question seriously, in the way they were asking it, required setting aside the who, not because the gods were certainly absent, that was not quite the claim, but because the question of what the world is made of and how it came to have the structure it has could be asked more precisely without them. The impersonal account, the account that spoke of water and heat and cold and the boundless, had a different kind of precision. It answered a different kind of question. It was not more true than the mythological account in some simple, obvious way. It was more useful for a particular purpose, the purpose of understanding the world as a system of natural processes rather than as the stage for divine drama. Anaximander was old enough to remember when there was nothing but the divine account, and young enough to feel that something else was possible. He had been taught by a man who was himself a part of this shift, who had taken the old question of what made the world and turned it into something that could be answered without invoking Gaia or Kronos or the divine genealogies of the theogony. He had learned the shape of that turn from Thales, and now he was beginning to feel that the turn needed to go further, not just away from gods, but toward something even less familiar than water, toward a principle that had no name yet because no name had been made for it. What Thales had done with his water was write a kind of prose, in the older sense, a straight declaration, a claim made in plain terms without the ceremonial dressing of the epic or the lyric. The poets who had preceded this tradition had wrapped their cosmogonic accounts in verse, in the structured repetitions and formal beauty of dactylic hexameter, in the authority that rhythm and rhyme lend to a claim when the claim needs to feel ancient and inevitable. Hesiod had told the story of the world's beginning in verse, because verse was the container in which serious and important things were held, the way that later centuries would hold serious things in the language of Scripture. To say a thing in verse was to say it with the authority of the tradition, to align oneself with what had come before. Anaximander, in composing his treatise on nature in prose, deliberate, plain, argumentative prose, was doing something that carried its own kind of authority, but a different kind. He was saying, in effect, that the explanation of the world does not need to be beautiful in the way that poetry is beautiful. It needs to be accurate. It needs to be honest. It needs to move from evidence to conclusion through the pressure of reason rather than through the pressure of tradition. The form of the claim was itself a claim, that truth does not require the clothing of verse to be true, that a plain sentence asserting a plain fact is exactly as capable of reaching the real as a line of Hesiod. This was not a small decision. It was a choice about what kind of thinking deserved to be called an account of the world, and Anaximander's choice put him on one side of a line that has not moved much in the centuries since. He was not entirely alone in this choice. The shift toward prose in philosophical and proto-scientific writing was happening in several places at once in the Greek world of the 6th century, and it is not quite accurate to say that any one person invented it. What is accurate is that Anaximander seems to have written something down, a treatise, a continuous piece of prose argument about the nature and origin of things, and that this act of writing, the deliberate setting down of a philosophical argument in prose form for an audience that might read it rather than hear it sung, belongs to the earliest examples of that kind of writing we have any record of. Ancient writers refer to it, they quote from it. One sentence from it survived the long erosion of centuries, preserved in a commentary on Aristotle's physics, written more than 1,000 years after Anaximander himself had lived and set his stylus down for the last time. One sentence from a man who had thought carefully enough about the origin of everything to write a whole treatise about it. The survival of that one sentence and the silence around it is itself a kind of philosophical lesson in the nature of what persists and what does not. But that belongs to a later part of the story, when the fragment itself deserves to be considered in the quiet it has earned by surviving so long. What matters at this earlier moment, in the city, in the schooling, in the morning still becoming noon of Anaximander's philosophical formation, is the question that Thales had pressed into the tradition like a seal into warm wax, leaving an impression that could not be smoothed away. What is the arche? What is the first principle? What is the origin that once removed removes everything, because everything was continuous with it? Thales had given the question its first systematic formulation in the Western tradition. He had found a candidate, water, and had argued for it on the basis of observation and the natural philosophy of transformation, and he had handed the question, with its candidate answer still attached, to a younger man who was beginning to feel the edge. The thing about receiving a philosophical question from a teacher is that the question arrives already partly answered. It arrives with the answer that the teacher found, still warm, still attached to the reasoning that produced it. And this warmth is both a help and a difficulty. It helps because it shows the direction the question was facing, the angle from which the teacher approached it, the landscape of considerations that seemed relevant. It is harder simply to ignore an answer than to have received no answer at all. A received answer forces the student to either adopt it or engage with it, and engagement is how the next step gets made. But the warmth is a difficulty because it can feel like the question is already settled, already closed, already pointing at its solution, and the student who is most gifted, the student who will eventually carry the question further, is the one who feels the warmth, and feels, despite it, that something is not quite finished. Anaximander felt that something was not quite finished. He had watched the ships in the harbor and felt the way that Thales felt when he watched them. The question of what all these different materials had in common, whether the cedar and the linen and the bronze and the water beneath the hull and the breath of the sailors were all, in some deeper sense, the same thing in different configurations. He had followed Thales far enough into the question to understand why water was a serious answer. He had sat with water long enough to feel its insufficiency, and what he felt at the edge of that insufficiency was something that had not yet been named. Not a failure, not a dead end, not a reason to give up on the question and return to the divine genealogies that still made sense to most of the people he knew. What he felt was an opening. The question, pressed a little harder than Thales had pressed it, opened onto something that no existing word quite covered. A name would come. It would be his name, the word he coined for the thing he found when he pressed the question past where Thales had left it. But the name came later, after the thinking had gone all the way to the edge. At this earlier moment, in the long proximity with Thales, and the long beginning of his own inquiry, there was only the question, and the inherited answer, and the feeling, growing steadily more certain with each return to the problem, that the answer was not quite large enough. Thales, for his part, seems to have been the kind of teacher who did not require his students to protect his conclusions. The tradition that presents him as Anaximander's teacher does not present him as someone who demanded agreement. He had arrived at his answer through reasoning, and if the reasoning could be followed further, if a student could take the question further than the teacher had been willing or able to take it, this would not have seemed to Thales like betrayal. It would have seemed like the continuation of the inquiry. This is one of the quieter and more admirable features of what happened at Miletus. The old man seems to have understood that the question mattered more than any particular answer to it, including his own. He had given his answer, and he had given his student the question. These were not the same gift. A younger man sitting across from an old one in a city whose harbor was still with late afternoon light. The older man had finished a thought. The younger man had received it, not the thought exactly, but the motion of the thought, the direction it was facing, the thing it was reaching toward. The old man was comfortable now, at rest with the answer he had worked out over a long life of careful looking. The younger man was less comfortable, but not in a way that hurt. It was more like the discomfort of a door that has been pushed almost closed, but not quite, where the slight asymmetry keeps drawing the attention back, not urgently, not anxiously, just persistently. The question that Thales had pressed into Anaximander's hands was still warm. It had not yet been answered in the way that would satisfy this particular kind of pressing. It sat between them in the late afternoon quiet, in a city where the smell of the sea came in through every open window, waiting for the younger man to carry it somewhere the older man had not been. Anaximander would carry it. He had his whole life ahead of him, years of careful thinking, of teaching his own students, of writing down his conclusions in the plain prose that he believed was adequate to the weight of what he had found. He would become the teacher where he had been the student, and the pattern would continue. Anaximenes, who would follow him, would sit across from Anaximander, the way Anaximander sat now, across from Thales, listening carefully, receiving the question, beginning already, in the deepest part of his attention, to feel where the edge was, beginning to form the first shape of a different answer. The question would pass again. It always passed. This was what the tradition at Miletus had discovered, perhaps without fully knowing it, that the value of a philosophical question lies not in its being finally answered, but in its being genuinely received, turned over, extended, and passed along. The question as an object held in successive hands, each pair of hands leaving its mark, each mind that held it finding it, at the end, still open, still warm, still asking, but that continuity and what it produced belongs to the longer story. At this moment, the question was still new in Anaximander's hands. The old man beside him was at rest. The harbor was still. The smell of cedar and salt was in the air, and in the quiet that followed the end of one teacher's thought, a younger man sat with something he had not yet found. The words for, knowing only that the question was real, and the answer he had received was not quite large enough, and holding both of these things carefully. The way one holds something of value before one has fully understood what kind of value it has. The question rested there between them, in the late afternoon quiet of a prosperous city, the edge of the Aegean, a city full of the goods of several worlds, a city prosperous enough to allow at least one of its citizens to spend his evenings thinking about the origin of everything rather than the price of grain. It had no edges. The question. It was not pointing at water, not exactly. It was pointing past water towards something older, something that would need a new word because no old word had been made for it. Anaximander had not yet spoken that word. He had not yet written it down, not yet shaped his thinking far enough to know what the word should be. But the question was in his hands. It was warm, and the quiet of having just received it, the quiet of a problem not yet approached but already felt, was the particular quiet of a mind on the edge of its first real step. Thales sat beside him, old and unhurried, at rest with his water and his years, watching the harbor light fade across the still surface of the afternoon sea. And Anaximander held the question and said nothing yet, and the silence between them had the quality of something that had just begun. Anaximander returned to the question with something that looked, from the outside, like patience. From the inside, it was more precise than that. It was the feeling of a word that had almost worked, a word that had arranged a great many things neatly, resolved a great many puzzles, and then in one specific place had quietly failed. He had listened to Thales long enough and carefully enough to know what the word was doing. He had also listened long enough to hear where it stopped. The word was water. Thales had looked at the world, the wet world, the world of moisture and sea, and the damp ground beneath plants, the world of morning condensation on stone, and the slow seep of rivers into earth, and had seen, in all of that variety, one substance wearing many shapes. Water, held cold, becomes stone hard. Water, roused to heat, rises invisible into the air. Living things are wet at their core. Even the earth itself, in Thales' account, floated like a great wooden disk on a surface of water, rocking gently on what underlies everything. It was an answer with genuine ambition. It reached for unity behind diversity, and in reaching for that, it was asking the right kind of question. Anaximander knew this. He had absorbed it. He had carried it. And then he had pressed on it, the way a person presses on a joint that has been injured, not roughly, not with impatience, but with the quiet attention of someone who needs to know exactly where the weakness is. The weakness was not hard to find once he pressed. If water is the fundamental substance of all things, then what is the status of fire? Fire does not seem to be a variant of water. It does not seem to be water wearing a different shape. Fire and water are not the same thing differently arranged. They are opposites. Heat and cold are opposites. Wetness and dryness are opposites. And if water is the origin of everything, then the dry things in the world, the arid desert, the blazing noon sky, the parched, cracked earth in a drought, are less fundamental than the wet things, derived from them in some way, subordinate to them in the hierarchy of being. But why should that be? What reason, other than the accident of having chosen water, would put one of these opposites above all others? If fire had been chosen, fire would seem to crowd out moisture. If earth had been chosen, earth would seem to absorb all else. Any determinate thing placed at the origin carries within itself the seeds of its own contradiction. It has a nature, and its nature is partial, and in being partial, it tilts the whole toward itself. Anaximander sat with this difficulty, not hurrying it, not looking for a clever move to escape it. What he found, in sitting with it long enough, was not another element. It was the realization that the question itself had been asking for something that no element could ever be. The origin of all things, the arche, the first principle, the thing from which everything else proceeds, could not itself be a thing in the ordinary sense. It could not be hot or cold, wet or dry, heavy or light, thick or thin. If it had any of those qualities, it would already be in conflict with its own opposite, and the origin of everything cannot be at war with itself. The origin must be prior to the conflict. It must be the ground in which opposites are both held before either of them arrives. This was not a retreat. It was not giving up on the question because it was too hard. It was following the question past the place where it had always been stopped, past the comfort of pointing at something and saying that thing is first, into a space that pointed back at the question itself, and asked whether anything visible could ever satisfy it. What Anaximander found in that space is what he called the apeiron. The word is made of two parts. The first is a prefix, a, which in Greek negates what follows it, the same prefix that makes the word for death into the word for the deathless, the same gesture of language that defines something by stripping away a limit. The second part comes from pyrrhus, which means a limit, a boundary, a defining edge. The apeiron, then, is the without limit, the without edge, not a thing that goes on forever in the way a very long road goes on, but something prior to extension itself, something that does not have an edge in the way that it does not have a color or a temperature or a preference. The absence of limit is not a deficiency, it is a definition. He did not choose this word carelessly. In the early 6th century BCE, choosing a word meant something. Language was not yet so crowded with technical terms that a new one could slip by unnoticed. To introduce a word, a precise, constructed word, a word that operated by negation rather than by pointing, was to make a philosophical claim before the argument had even begun. The word itself was the beginning of the argument. The apeiron, Anaximander said, is the source from which all things come. It is not a substance among substances, not one of the four candidates the tradition was already circling: water, fire, earth, air. It is, in some sense, all of them at once, and also none of them in particular. It holds them all before any of them emerge as themselves. It is what is present before water is water, and fire is fire, and cold is cold, the prior ground from which those determinate natures are, in some process, separated out and set against each other. Imagine holding something in cupped hands, something liquid, familiar, immediate. There is the weight of it, the temperature, the slight shifting against the skin, and then imagine setting it down, carefully, without anger, without dismissal, because the weight and the temperature and the familiarity are exactly the problem. They are the marks of a determinate thing, a particular thing, a thing that is this and not that. And what is needed is not a particular thing. What is needed is something for which no particular description will ever be quite right. Setting the water down is not a failure. It is the beginning of an honesty the question has been waiting for. The apeiron is eternal. This was essential to Anaximander's thinking, not as a theological claim, but as a philosophical necessity. Whatever generates all things cannot itself have been generated, at least not without producing an infinite regress, without having to posit something that generated the generator, and then something that generated that, and so on, without end. The chain has to stop somewhere, and the place where it stops is not a wall or a floor. It is not something that closes off the inquiry, but rather a ground that was never born and will never perish, a ground whose permanence is the condition of everything else's impermanence, because the apeiron does not die. Things born from it can die, because it does not diminish. What emerges from it can be temporary. Its indestructibility is precisely what permits the world its constant change. This is one of the quieter elegances in Anaximander's position, and it is easy to pass over it. The boundless does not produce bounded things, despite its boundlessness. It produces bounded things because of it. The origin must be inexhaustible, so that what originates from it can be finite. The source must be without limit, so that what comes from it can have limits of its own. The relationship between the apeiron and the world it generates is not arbitrary, but structurally necessary, each term depending on the nature of the other. There is a persistent question among those who have read Anaximander carefully, a question that has not been resolved, and that probably cannot be resolved given the small fragments of his work that survive. The question is whether the apeiron is a material thing, a kind of undifferentiated physical mixture in which all the elements are already present but not yet separated, or whether it is something genuinely abstract, something that is not matter at all, but more like a principle or a condition or a ground that is not itself subject to the categories we use to describe material things. Charles Kahn, who has written with great care about Anaximander, has pressed this question from one angle. FM Blisteit Erben Ro, where Kan's Willoven Everytho Stallaster, with the Justenhen something of to something the release of Tubercum Talkeres. Cornford pressed it from another, decades earlier. Neither arrived at a settled answer, and neither could, because Anaximander himself left too little for any reading to become definitive. Both interpretations illuminate something real, both leave something unexplained. The question rests there, open, between them, not a failure of scholarship, but a true reflection of how far the evidence reaches and where it stops. What can be said is that the apeiron does not sit still. It is not a container in which the world was once stored and then poured out. It is a source in the active sense, a perpetual origin, something that is continuously producing, not in a single moment of creation that exhausted itself and ceased, but in an ongoing way, as though the generation of the world from the boundless is not a past event, but a present condition. The world is, at every moment, still emerging. The structures and forms and things that fill experience are at every moment still being separated out from the prior ground that has no structure and no form and no name. Pairs of opposites separate from the apeiron. This was Anaximander's way of describing how the world gets its content. Hot and cold, wet and dry, these are not created individually, they are separated together, the way a single thing held still can, when it begins to move, produce both the forward and the backward of its motion at once. One does not precede the other. They arise as a pair, as a relationship, because the possibility of one already implies the other. Cold has no meaning except against heat. Dry has no content except in contrast to wet. The apeiron, in generating the world, does not produce these things one by one. It gives rise to the difference between them, and that difference is where the world begins. A silence before any sound has arrived holds the possibility of many sounds without belonging to any of them. Warmth and cold are not in a silence. They have not yet been separated from each other. They are still folded together in the prior, and then, without announcement, without divine command, as a process Anaximander seems to have understood as natural and necessary, rather than miraculous, the difference opens. The warm goes toward warmth, and the cold toward cold. The particular temporary structures of the world begin to take shape. There is something in this picture that resists easy visualization. The apeiron is not a place and not a substance and not a force, exactly, though it does something that resembles what forces do. It does not look like anything. It cannot be pointed at. Even in the act of trying to think about it directly, the mind finds that it is already reaching past it, trying to make it into a determinate thing, trying to give it a color or a texture or a position in space. And the apeiron defeats that attempt, not by retreating, but simply by being what it is, which is the prior ground of all colors and textures and positions, rather than one among them. Anaximander understood this difficulty. It is part of why the word he chose is a negative word, a word that defines by privation rather than by description. There is no positive account of what the apeiron is, because any positive account would already be too particular, would already have attributed to the origin some quality that belongs to the world, that originates from it. The only honest description is the negative one, not bounded, not limited, not finite, not particular. What remains when every particular description has been stripped away? Not a nothing, but the beyond of all particular somethings. This is a form of thinking that would recur. Later philosophers would reach for similar strategies, would try to describe the origin of things, or the absolute, or the deepest ground of existence, by saying what it is not, rather than what it is, because no positive description could avoid distorting it. Anaximander was not the last to press against this difficulty, but he was, as far as the record shows, among the first. And he reached this position not through mystical intuition, but through philosophical argument, through pressing on a specific word, water, until it failed, and then following the failure as far as it would lead. The open sea at night, past the point where any shore is visible, offers a particular kind of experience. The water in every direction has no beginning and no end from where the observer stands. There is no edge to press against. The darkness is not threatening, it is simply vast, and the vastness has no particular quality, no wall, no place where something different starts. The mind that finds itself in that vastness without fear, without the need to locate a boundary, is doing something not unlike what Anaximander's concept asks of it. Not a surrender of attention, but a release of the habit of always looking for the edge, always wanting to know where something stops. The apeiron is not the ocean, and Anaximander would not have made the comparison directly. The ocean is finite, is bounded, is wet and not dry, is already a determinate thing. But the experience of standing in the presence of something whose limit is not available to perception, that experience is a kind of practice for the philosophical attitude the apeiron requires. Not to panic at the absence of edges, not to rush to fill the open space with a convenient boundary, to let the opening be what it is, which is larger than anything that could be placed inside it. The apeiron does not choose to generate the world. It is not a deity weighing options, not a craftsman deciding on a plan. Its generation of the world is, in Anaximander's account, as natural and necessary as heat rising and cold sinking, as impersonal as any other feature of how things are. This is one of the places where the Milesian school, and Anaximander within it, made a decisive shift. Not loudly, not with proclamation, but in the quiet insistence on impersonal process, where the tradition had placed divine agency. The origin was not a who, it was a what, or perhaps it was not even a what in the full sense, being prior to the distinction between things and not things. But whatever it was not choosing, it was not purposing, it was simply continuously giving rise, the way a condition gives rise to what happens within it, without intending anything. There is a kind of relief available in this, if it is held steadily. The world does not owe its existence to a decision that could have gone otherwise. The world is not the product of a preference that might, in principle, have preferred something different. What arises from the apeiron arises because that is what arises, because the nature of the boundless is to produce the bounded, as the nature of silence is to be broken by sound without resisting it. The world is not contingent in the way that a gift is contingent on the generosity of the giver. It emerges from what is without asking permission, without requiring an occasion. Anaximander's contemporaries were still telling the story of the world in terms of divine will and cosmic genealogy. Hesiod, not many generations earlier, had given the tradition a detailed account of how the gods arose from each other, how chaos came first, and from chaos came Gaia, and from Gaia came the Titans, and from the conflict of divine generations came the order of the world. These were not naive stories. They held genuine wisdom about conflict and generation, and the way order emerges from disorder. But they answered the question of origin by pointing at something that was itself a something, something with a nature, and a history, and a relationship to other somethings. Anaximander's move was to go further back, to point at a prior that had no nature in the ordinary sense, no history that could be narrated, no relationship to anything that preceded it, because nothing preceded it. The thought is austere in the best sense, stripped of ornament, stripped of story, stripped of the reassurance that behind the origin there is a face or a will or a purpose. What remains after all of that is stripped away is something that is harder to hold, but in Anaximander's view, more honest. The origin is not like us. It does not think or choose or prefer. It simply is without qualification, and from that unqualified being, qualified things emerge and live briefly in their particularity and return. Return is important here, but its full weight belongs to the fragment, to the moral and cosmic language Anaximander used to describe what happens to things when their time is done. What can be said in approaching the apeiron itself is that it is not diminished by what emerges from it, and not increased by what returns to it. The boundless does not accumulate the bounded. It does not grow richer when things dissolve back into it, or poorer when they separate out. It remains always what it is, the inexhaustible ground, the without limit, the prior that was never young and will never be old. The scholarly disagreement about whether the apeiron is material or non-material, mixture or abstraction, is real and worth sitting with. It is not a false problem, not a confusion produced by bad terminology. It is a genuine tension inside the concept itself, a tension that Anaximander may have felt but did not resolve in the few words that survive him. What is interesting about this unresolved tension is not that it represents a failure in the thinking, but that it represents an honest reaching, a philosopher arriving at the edge of what his conceptual vocabulary could do, and pressing forward anyway, knowing that what lay ahead could not yet be fully said. Aristotle would later describe the apeiron in terms that flattened it somewhat, fitting it into his own taxonomic account of earlier thinkers. The doxographical tradition, the ancient writers who summarized the views of the philosophers before them, preserved the word and some of the arguments, but inevitably simplified what they preserved. What is left in the fragments and reports that survive is enough to see the shape of the thought without being able to see all of its features, enough to know that Anaximander was doing something that had not been done before, and that the something he was doing is still not finished. A mind that settles into the contemplation of the apeiron finds that there is nowhere specific to land. The concept does not offer a surface. It does not resolve into an image. It is not like arriving at a destination after a journey. It is more like noticing that the journey has no destination in the ordinary sense, and that this is not a problem to be solved but a condition to be inhabited. The open ground is not empty. It is full in a way that is prior to the distinction between full and empty, holding both as possibilities without being either. This is the philosophical attitude Anaximander's thinking invites, and it is an attitude that requires practice rather than understanding. Understanding would want to grasp the apeiron, would want to turn it into a clear concept with defined edges. But the apeiron, by definition, defeats that want, not aggressively, not by hiding, but simply by being what it is, which is the prior of all clearly defined things. What remains when the want to grasp is set aside is something quieter, not nothing, not emptiness, something that is simply there, prior and continuous and unhurried, beneath every bounded thing that has ever briefly asserted itself and then let go. Anaximander wrote in prose. This matters for the apeiron. Hesiod, describing the origin of the gods, wrote in hexameter, the long, rhythmically dense lines of the epic tradition, verse that carries the authority of song, the weight of sacred speech. Anaximander's prose does not have that rhythm, does not invoke that authority. It is drier in form, more exposed, more vulnerable to the objection that it simply did not work as an explanation. Verse hides certain failures behind its music. Prose cannot do that. To write in prose about the origin of all things was to accept a higher standard of accountability, to say, in effect, that this account should stand or fall on its own terms, without the shelter of poetic form. The apeiron, then, was presented to the world in a medium that made no appeal to tradition, no appeal to sacred memory, no appeal to the authority of the singing voice. It was laid out in ordinary Greek prose, in a way that anyone with sufficient patience could read and press on, the way Anaximander himself had pressed on water. It was offered as something that could be questioned. That willingness to be questioned is part of what makes it philosophical rather than mythological, not because myth is unintelligent, but because philosophy is a specific practice, a practice of subjecting ideas to the very kind of pressure that is also brought to bear on them. There are places where the contemplation of the apeiron produces something unexpected, not a solution, not a revelation, but a kind of softening, the habit of mind that always needs to locate itself in relation to known things, always needs a reference point, always needs the edges that define where here is and where there is. Not here. That habit, when it relaxes, finds that what it was pressing against was not the world but its own insistence on having something to press against. The apeiron is not a thing to rest on, but it is something to rest into, or rather, it is what remains when the rest into distinction itself begins to dissolve. This is not mysticism. Anaximander was not a mystic. He was an empirically attentive person who looked at the world with great care and then followed his philosophical arguments wherever they led, even when they led away from the visible and toward the prior of the visible. The apeiron emerged from argument, not from vision, but arguments, followed far enough, can arrive at places that feel less like conclusions and more like openings, places where the mind, having done its careful work, finds itself at an edge that is not really an edge, because what is on the other side of it is the same as what is on this side, which is the boundless holding everything continuously and without effort as it has always been doing. Anaximander lived in a city. Ships arrived, goods were unloaded, merchants argued about prices. The harbor was loud with the commerce of several civilizations pressing against each other, and in the middle of all of that determined, particular, bounded activity, the cedar from one place, the linen from another, the bronze traded across water that both separated and connected, one person was working out that beneath all of it, beneath the specificity and the variety and the noise, there was something that had no specificity and no variety and could not be made louder or quieter, something that was not in the harbor or in the goods or in the water. The ships rested on, but prior to all of those, prior in the sense that makes prior a strange word, because the apeiron is not earlier in time, the way a parent is earlier than a child. It is prior in the way that the possibility of all the words in a language is prior to any one of them being spoken. The question Thales left behind was not answered by water, and Anaximander understood this before he could say why, and then, over the years of his thinking life, worked out why in enough detail to give the understanding a name. The name was apeiron. The name did not resolve the question, it deepened it, made it larger and more honest, stripped it of the premature comfort of a visible answer. The question of where all things come from is still, after the apeiron, a genuinely open question. It is just more clearly open. It is open in a way that knows itself to be open, rather than falsely closed by the wrong kind of answer. There is a stillness in that, not the stillness of a question that is given up, but the stillness of a question that has found its true form, that has shed the shapes that were too small for it, and arrived at the shape that matches what it is actually asking. The apeiron is the response to what the question was actually asking, which was not which element is most fundamental, but what kind of thing could ever be first, and whether something first could have any of the qualities that make things the particular things they are. The answer is no. The origin cannot be particular, and in arriving at that no, Anaximander opened something that has not closed in the time since. He let the origin remain unnamed in the sense that matters, not without a word assigned to it, but without a determinate nature that closes off the inquiry. The apeiron holds the question open. It says, the source of all things is the kind of thing that cannot be fully described, because every description would already be borrowing qualities from what it is trying to explain. And then, having said that, it settles, not into an answer, into the quiet that comes after an honest intellectual act, the quiet of a question that has been followed as far as it can be followed and left without anxiety in the open ground where it belongs. The night in any particular place has no particular color. It is not quite black and not quite the absence of light. It is just the way things look when the light has withdrawn and the outlines have gone soft, and the air is the same temperature as the thought that passes through it. In that dark, the apeiron is not anywhere special. It is not more present in the dark than in the daylight, not more available to philosophical contemplation in the small hours than at noon. But the dark helps, perhaps, because the dark has already done some of the work of removing the specific and the bounded, already softened the hard edges of the visible world into something less insistently particular, something that invites the mind to rest in what does not have to be named. Anaximander spent his life pressing on the origin of things. He pressed until the word water was no longer sufficient, and then he pressed until the better word arrived, and the better word was not more precise in the usual sense. It was more precise in the sense that it matched the actual shape of the question, the actual reach of the inquiry. The apeiron is as precise as Anaximander could be, which means it is the most accurate thing that can be said about what is first, and what is most accurate is the without limit, the beyond all edges, the prior of the particular, still continuing as it always has, beneath all the bounded things that have briefly and beautifully been. The mind that reaches for the apeiron and does not find a surface to touch. That mind is doing exactly what Anaximander asked of it, not understanding, not grasping, but opening, releasing the pressure of always needing to arrive somewhere, letting the origin be what it is, which is the kind of thing that holds all arrivals without itself ever arriving anywhere, because it was never on its way to anything, because it was always already the ground in which all journeys take place. This is what remains when the reaching stops. Not emptiness, not loss, something that has been here the whole time, prior to the question, and prior to the questioner, and prior to the night in which both of them rest, open, unnamed, without limit, without edge, continuing quietly in the only way the boundless knows how to continue, which is without beginning and without end, and without anything left over that needs to be explained. Anaximander stood at the edge of the harbor at night, looking up, not at the gods, not at the stories the stars had always been asked to carry. He looked the way a person looks when they have decided, quietly and without ceremony, that the patterns overhead are real before they are divine, that the light reaching his eyes has traveled from somewhere specific through something specific by means that can in principle be understood. The harbor of Miletus was dark at this hour, the ships resting, the waters still. Above him the sky was full. He stood in it the way a person stands in a field, aware of the dimensions around them, measuring without tools, asking without speaking. This was not piety. It was something older than piety, and something stranger. It was the particular attention of a mind that has decided the world can be looked at directly and found to answer. He had inherited from his teacher a question about what everything was made of, and he had spent long time with that question, turning it, pressing on its edges, following it to places it did not want to go. The answer his teacher had given was water. Water was everywhere, took every shape, was the medium of life, and the substance of sea, and the moisture inside every living thing. It was a reasonable answer. It was an answer that had required courage to give, because it was an answer that needed no God to be true. But Anaximander had sat with it long enough to feel where it came apart, and what he saw when he looked up was the first piece of evidence against it. The sky was dry. The fire of those distant lights was not water wearing a different shape. Something was burning up there, something hot and bright, and water did not burn. Water did not become fire by being squeezed or stretched or moved into a different place. The answer was too small. The territory it had been asked to cover was larger than it could reach. So he looked up and began to think about what a first thing would have to be, if it were going to be first in the way everything required, not partial, not particular, not already committed to a quality that would make it the enemy of its opposite. And the sky above Miletus, dark and wide and full of light, arriving from distances he could not name, seemed to him the closest available image of what he was beginning to think about. Not the sky itself, not the fire and the rings he was already imagining, but the sheer scope of it. The sense that whatever was back behind all of this, whatever had given rise to the cold of the water and the heat of the fire and the dryness of the air and the density of the earth, had to be something that was none of those things, and all of them at once. Something that had no edge, where it became one thing rather than another. He stood there for a long time. The stars turned slowly. The harbor remained still. What he was arriving at was not yet an image. It was not yet a word. It was the shape of a thought that had just become unavoidable. The recognition that the origin of everything, if it was going to be the origin of everything, could not already be something in particular. The world he was trying to explain had come from somewhere, and that somewhere had to be unlike the world itself. He thought about the way fire and water stand against each other in the world, the way a flame and a wave are not merely different, but actively opposed, so that wherever one is dominant, the other is suppressed. If water were the first thing, first in the way that a parent is prior to a child, then fire would be in some sense derived from water, a temporary arrangement of water that had forgotten what it was. But fire does not behave like something that has forgotten. It is water. Fire behaves like something that is genuinely fire, something that has its own nature, something that pushes back against the wet and the cold with the full force of a thing that is what it is. To say that water was prior to fire was to say that fire's nature was borrowed, that the heat pressing back against the cold was really the cold wearing a disguise. And that was not an account of fire. That was an account of water pretending to be fire, which explained nothing. The first thing, then, had to be something that had not yet committed to any quality, something that could give rise to warmth without itself being warm, that could give rise to cold without itself being cold, that stood before the great division of things into their natures in a state of complete prior openness. Not a mixture of everything, the way a jar of everything together would still contain everything. Something genuinely different, something that by its nature could not be named by any of the names belonging to the things that had come out of it. He had a word for it eventually. Well, the Greeks would call it the apeiron, the boundless, the thing without limit or edge. But the word came after the thought, as words always do. Before the word, there was just the looking, the harbor, the sky, the fire overhead, arranged in its great wheeling patterns, and a man trying to follow his thinking to the place where the thinking had to stop using ordinary names. The cosmos, as Anaximander understood it, had not always looked like this. There was a time, not a time that any human memory could reach, not a time that any god had supervised, when there was only the boundless, infinite, and undifferentiated, neither warm nor cold, neither wet nor dry, containing in some prior and unnamed way the potential for all the differences the world would eventually make actual. And then something happened. Not a command, not a creation, not an act of will directed from outside. Something more like a settling or a stirring, the first differentiation, the first crease in what had been, without crease, the moment when the apeiron began to give out from itself the paired opposites that would then go to work on each other and produce, through their conflict and their interaction, the structured world that turns above the harbor at Miletus. What came first from the boundless was not one thing but two, or rather a pair, warmth and cold, separating from a unity that had been neither. The warm gathered outward and became the fire of the sky. The cold settled inward and became the earth's cold center, moist and dense, surrounded by air, and around it all the fire wrapping itself like a skin, the way bark wraps around the living wood of a tree. This was the first image Anaximander had for how the world had arranged itself, a bark of fire around a cold and wet interior, the heat pressing from outside, the cold holding at the center, and between them the air and the mist and all the distance of the sky. The image of bark around a tree was not decoration. It was a way of thinking about the relationship between a thing and what surrounds it. The fire was not separate from the cold it enclosed, but related to it, the way a boundary is related to what it bounds, each giving the other its definition, each requiring the other to be what it is. The warmth could only be warmth in relation to the cold it pressed against. The cold could only hold its shape in relation to the fire that surrounded it. The world was not a collection of independent things. It was a system of tensions, each side maintained by the pressure of the other. And then the fire began to break apart. Not catastrophically, not all at once. The sphere of fire that had wrapped itself around the world tore into sections, into rings, and each ring sealed itself inside a sheath of air and mist, hidden from direct view, carrying its fire around and around the earth in great and patient circles. The sun was one such ring. The moon was another. The stars were a third, or rather a third set, smaller, lower, closer to the earth than the sun and moon, their fires burning through apertures in their sheaths and reaching the earth's surface as the still scattered lights of a night sky. The rings were invisible. What was visible was only what leaked through, the specific places in each ring where the compressed fire found an opening in the mist and escaped as light. This was a thought that required a particular kind of mind to hold it. The sky, which seemed so obviously a surface, a ceiling, a dome, a place where gods walked, was for Anaximander a volume, a depth. The sun was not a disk moving across a ceiling, but a fire moving inside a concealed channel, and what the eye saw as the sun's disk was merely the aperture through which the ring's fire was visible. The stars were not points affixed to a surface, but holes in the casings of smaller rings, arranged at various distances, each carrying its own enclosed fire. To think this required the willingness to say that the sky hides more than it shows, that the visible is not the real structure, but only the visible part of it. It required trusting inference over appearance. It required being willing to say, what I can see suggests a structure I cannot see, and the structure I cannot see is more fundamental than the appearance it produces. This was not a small thing. The sky had been the most obvious place in human experience to look for divine presence. It was above, it moved, it was orderly in a way that the earth below was not. It contained the lights that governed seasons and fixed directions and returned with absolute regularity, year after year. To say that its lights were apertures in compressed rings of fire was not merely to give a different explanation of a natural phenomenon. It was to remove from the sky every quality that had made it feel divine, and to replace that feeling with a geometry. The sky was still orderly. The rings still circled with perfect regularity. But the regularity was no longer evidence of intention. It was evidence of mechanics, of things that once set in motion continued because there was no reason for them to stop. Eclipses had always been the most unsettling events in the sky, the moments when the light seemed to fail, when the order wobbled, when the divine powers seemed to communicate something ominous in the language of sudden darkness. Anaximander's account of the eclipse was, in its way, the most radical thing he said about the sky. An eclipse of the moon was not a sign. It was not a message. The aperture in the moon's ring had partially or wholly closed. The mist had thickened. The opening had narrowed. The light that normally escaped had been reduced or blocked, and in a while it would open again because there was nothing wrong, because nothing had been communicated, because the sky contained no messages, only mechanics. He said this in a city where people still prayed at eclipses. He said it to students who had grown up with the understanding that unusual events in the sky were unusual precisely because they required unusual attention, because they asked something of the people who witnessed them. And he said it not with contempt for those beliefs, but with the calm confidence of a person who has followed an argument to a conclusion that does not permit a different answer. The aperture closed, it would open again. That was what had happened. The earth itself, in Anaximander's account, had a shape and a position that was no less strange when thought about carefully. He described it as a short cylinder, a drum of stone, wider than it was tall, flat on top and flat on the bottom, the surface where living things lived being the upper flat face. The proportion he had in mind seems to have been something like a depth of 1 unit to a width of 3, though the precise figures belong to him and have not survived intact. What has survived is the essential image, a flat drum of stone, hanging at the center of the world, unsupported, held in place by nothing but its own position. The position was the argument. Anaximander had noticed something that was obvious once stated, but had apparently not been stated before. The earth is at the center of everything, equidistant from every surrounding region, and therefore there is no direction it has more reason to fall toward than any other. Up is toward the fire. Down is also toward the fire. In the other direction, left and right are also toward the fire. The earth is surrounded, perfectly and without bias, by everything it could possibly fall toward, and because no direction has priority over any other, the earth does not fall, it stays. This was reasoning from symmetry, from the principle that where no reason exists to prefer one outcome over another, neither outcome obtains. The earth hangs because hanging is the only thing it can do, given where it is. No god is holding it. No ocean is bearing it up. No pillar is supporting it. The earth is held in place by the same logic that holds a thought at rest when nothing pushes it toward any particular conclusion, not by force, but by the equal distribution of all the forces that might otherwise have displaced it. The image of the earth as a drum hanging free at the center of a universe of encircling rings was, in its own way, as beautiful as anything the mythological cosmogonies had offered. It was a different kind of beauty, not the beauty of narrative, not the beauty of divine will made visible in form, but the beauty of a structure that holds itself together by its own internal necessity, each part supporting the others by the logic of its position. The fire contained the cold. The cold gave shape to the fire. The earth hung at the center without support, because the center was the only place where support was not needed. The rings circled because they had no reason to stop. Everything was where it was, because everywhere else would have been inconsistent with the forces already at work. There was time in Anaximander's account, and it was vast, not the time of human generations, not the time of dynasties, or the long memory of a city's founding. The time his cosmology required was of a different order, a time large enough to contain the formation of a cosmos and its dissolution and the formation of another cosmos in the same boundless space. He seems to have held, and the ancient witnesses who preserved his views suggest he held, that the world arising from the apeiron was not unique. Other worlds had arisen. Other worlds would arise. The boundless was not the kind of thing that could give rise to a world only once, because the boundless was exactly that, without limit, without the kind of boundary that would make a single act of world formation final. The thought is one of those thoughts that, once held, makes the world feel briefly very large and very quiet. Somewhere within the apeiron, at this moment, or at some moment without a particular name, another process of differentiation had begun, or had already completed itself, or had completed itself and dissolved. Another cold center, another bark of fire, another arrangement of rings carrying their enclosed flames in patient circles around another flat drum of stone, and then that arrangement subsiding, not destroyed, because nothing in Anaximander's account is destroyed, but returned, its components releasing their particular qualities back into the boundless from which those qualities had briefly separated, the fire cooling, the cold dispersing, the rings opening, and the light going out, not as catastrophe, but as completion. The boundless received it all back without ceremony. And then, perhaps, another beginning. Not a new beginning, from nothing but a new differentiation, from the inexhaustible source that had always been there and would always be there, capable of giving rise to ordered worlds, the way a deep body of water is capable of giving rise to waves, the waves appearing, traveling, breaking, returning, the water remaining, patient and unchanged beneath every form it momentarily produces. Anaximander seems not to have regarded this as melancholy. The sources that preserve his thinking do not preserve a tone of loss around the dissolution of worlds. What they preserve is something more like the tone of a person who has looked at a very large process from a sufficiently large distance and found it, at that distance, orderly. The worlds arose because the boundless was generative. They dissolved because they were particular, and the particular, anything that has a determinate shape, a quality, a boundary, cannot hold that shape indefinitely against the pull of what surrounds it. This was not a flaw in the design. It was the design. It was the design. The particular was always going to be temporary. The boundless was always going to remain. The cold at the center of the world and the fire at its periphery were always pressing against each other, always contending for territory, always maintaining through their conflict the tension that kept the world in the dynamic balance. Anaximander recognized as the ordinary condition of nature, not a stable peace, but a maintained struggle, each side holding its own precisely because the other side kept pressing. Summer and winter were not different states of the same neutral thing. They were opponents, each one occupying the year's territory for its allotted time before yielding to the other's advance. The season turning, not because a god decided, but because the forces at work in the world operated in cycles, the warmth expanding and then retreating, the cold advancing and then giving ground, the whole thing turning in its great annual rotation with the same patient indifference as the rings above. Living things had entered this world through water. Anaximander had looked at the world's creatures and had asked the question that was, in its own way, the most personal version of the larger question about origins. Where did creatures like us come from, and what does our origins say about our nature? The answer he arrived at was strange and careful. The first living things had been generated in moisture, in the wet mud where water meets earth, not formed by a god from clay, not breathed into existence by a divine intention, but arising the way things arise in Anaximander's world generally, through the interaction of the physical conditions that already existed, through heat acting on moisture, through the mixing of the elements that the world's initial differentiation had produced. Life was not separate from the physical world. It was a product of the same forces that had made the rings of fire and the cold center and the long rotation of the seasons. The first creatures had been protected by shells or by coverings like bark, the same word he had used for the fire's outer layer, a natural casing against the harshness of the early world. Some of these creatures had eventually come onto the land, and human beings, he had noticed, were peculiar among the land's creatures in the length of time they required helpless before they could sustain themselves. An infant could not survive without care for years, which meant that a human infant dropped into the primitive world that Anaximander imagined. The world of the first emergence of life from heated mud would not have survived. Human beings, therefore, could not have been the original form of life. Something else must have come first, something more self-sufficient at birth, something more aquatic, something that only later gave rise to creatures that could eventually become what human beings were now. He was following the argument. He was not refusing to include himself in it. His own nature, the nature of the listeners he spoke to, the long history of the body he inhabited, all of it was part of the same cosmology that had produced the rings of fire and the cold center and the great patient cycling of the boundless giving rise to worlds and receiving them back. He was a late differentiation of something that had been going on for a very long time before he arrived to notice it. There was a particular kind of attention that came from standing in Miletus at night, looking up at the sky with these thoughts in mind, the thought that the stars were apertures, that the earth was a drum, that the human body had come from the sea, that the whole arrangement would in time dissolve and reform within the boundless. It was not the attention of awe in the old sense, the sense in which awe meant the presence of a power greater than the human, and the corresponding diminishment of the human in the face of that power. It was something quieter, something more like recognition. The rings were turning, the earth was hanging, the seasons were pressing against each other in their slow, vast competition. The fire was circling, the cold was holding, and all of it, the harbor water, and the distant rings, and the mud where life had first appeared, and the dry air of the evening, and the specific weight of a stone lifted in the hand, all of it had come from the same source, and would return to it. And the source was not troubled by any of this, because the source had no quality that could be troubled, no boundary that could be pressed, no shape that could be distorted, no name that could be given and then found insufficient. The stars moved. Anaximander watched them. He had drawn the world, or had attempted to draw it, had taken the shape of the known coastlines and the known lands, and had arranged them on a surface in proportion, had replaced the mythological geography of divine territories with the observable geography of a world that could be measured and represented as a shape. Egypt was where Egypt was. The Black Sea was where the Black Sea was. The distances between them were not the distances of a story, but the distances of a geometry. He had committed to paper or wax the radical claim that the world had a structure that did not require a storyteller to give it shape, that the land and the sea arranged themselves according to principles that could be represented rather than narrated. This was the same gesture he had made with the sky. The sky was not a narrative. The land was not a narrative. They were arrangements, structures, patterns that the mind could map and measure and reason about without asking who had intended them or what they were meant to convey. The world did not mean things in the way that stories meant things. The world had structure. The structure could be understood. Understanding it was different from finding its meaning, and understanding it did not require that it have one. On a clear night in Miletus, with the rings of fire turning overhead, and the cold drum of the earth beneath, and the boundless extending in every direction beyond the outermost ring into the patient infinity from which all things had come, and to which all things would return, the world was very large and very still. Other worlds were out there somewhere in that immensity, arising and dissolving with the same indifference, the same patient cycling, the same impersonal generativity of the boundless that had produced this one. They had their own rings, if rings were what the boundless gave rise to in every process of differentiation. They had their own cold centers, their own long rotations of season and fire, their own late arrivals of life from the mud, their own upward-looking figures standing in harbors at night and trying to find, in the patterns above them, some principle large enough to explain how all of it had begun. Or perhaps they did not. Perhaps the boundless gave rise to different forms in different places, forms so unlike the rings and drums of Miletus that no word from Anaximander's vocabulary could fit them. The apeiron was not obligated to produce the same world twice. The apeiron had no obligations. It was simply generative, indefinitely and without exhaustion, the way a silence that contains everything is not diminished by any sound it gives rise to. And all those worlds, however they were shaped, whatever cold held at their center, and whatever fire circled at their edge, were temporary. Temporary not in the way that a human life is temporary, brief and personal, and surrounded by the grief of those who will outlast it, but temporary in the way that a wave is temporary, a temporary configuration of something that will persist after the configuration dissolves, that was persisting before the configuration formed, that was not changed by giving rise to the configuration, and will not be changed by receiving it back. The dissolution of a world was not a loss to the boundless. The boundless did not lose the world when the world returned. The world had been the boundless all along, arranged into a particular temporary shape by the first differentiation and the forces that followed, and when those forces reached their limit and the arrangement began to relax, what the boundless received was only itself, coming back from a form it had briefly taken. Anaximander stood at the harbor and let the thought settle. The rings were turning slowly above him, their apertures holding steady, the fire inside them invisible except where it escaped, as light. The earth hung below him and above him and on every side of him at the same time, because up and down were only directions in relation to the earth, and the earth had no absolute direction, only the equidistance of its perfect central position. The harbor smelled of brine and timber. The city behind him was quiet. He was not the first being to look up at the sky from the surface of a cold center, surrounded by circling fire. Other creatures had been looking up, if they looked up at all, since the first ones had crawled from the heated mud and begun whatever life the world's early conditions had permitted them. He was not special in the way that made the looking meaningful because it was his looking. He was special only in that the looking, in him, had reached a point where it was trying to understand itself, where the creature that had come from the apeiron through mud and moisture and the long patient work of the seasons was now trying to think about what the apeiron was, and what its own presence at the edge of the harbor said about the relationship between the boundless and the particular. He was a particular. He knew this, a shaped thing, a bounded thing, a differentiation that had held its form for some decades, and would hold it for some more, and then would begin, very slowly, and then all at once, to dissolve back into the elements that had composed it. those elements returning to the general circulation of the world's substances, the world's substances eventually returning in their own vast time to the boundless that had given rise to the whole arrangement. This was not a frightening thought to him, or at least it does not arrive, through the ancient testimony that preserves it, as a frightening thought. It arrives as an honest thought, a thought that follows from following the argument where it goes, a thought that, once thought clearly, becomes simply the ground of the other thoughts, the stable surface from which the rest of the understanding proceeds. The rings kept turning. The stars held their apertures open against the dark sheaths that contained them. The city of Miletus rested in the night, its harbor quiet, its streets empty, its prosperity built on trade with every direction of the known world. The cedar and the grain, and the bronze and the linen, all having found their way here from everywhere, all of it temporary, all of it arranged and rearranged by the same forces that had arranged the rings above and the cold center below, and somewhere in the boundless at no particular distance, because the boundless had no geometry of distances, another world had been, or was being, or would be the same kind of temporary arrangement, arising in the same way, holding for its own duration, dissolving back without ceremony into the source that was neither warm nor cold, neither wet nor dry, neither here nor there, neither named nor nameable, but present, always present, beneath every form that presence ever takes. The rings turned, the apertures held their light, the harbor remained still, and whatever the boundless was, whatever name could be given to the absence of a name, it was doing what it always did, what it would do long after Miletus was quiet, and the rings above it had ceased to mean anything to anyone standing at the harbor's edge. It was producing, without interruption, and without intention, and without the need for any witness, the endless patient succession of formed things, from which all looking, all thinking, all standing at the edge of dark water comes. Things perish back into that from which they came, according to necessity, and they pay penalty and retribution to one another for their injustice, according to the assessment of time. Hold that for a moment. Let it sit the way an old stone sits, not demanding anything, not explaining itself, simply there, with the particular density of something that has been in one place for a very long time. That sentence is more than 2,500 years old. It is among the oldest pieces of prose in the Western tradition, and it arrived not as a poem, not as a prayer, not as the utterance of a god or a prophet, but as the considered conclusion of a man who had been thinking carefully about what everything is and where everything goes. Anaximander of Miletus set it down in ordinary language, the language of contracts and law courts, and aimed it at the whole of existing reality, at the stars, the seasons, the rivers, the bodies of living creatures, the empires of men, and the slow cycling of worlds, too vast to hold in any single mind at once. All of it, he said, all of it pays, all of it returns. Simplicius, a philosopher writing commentaries on Aristotle more than 1,000 years after Anaximander's death, is the one who preserved the fragment. He copied it into his commentary on the physics, almost as an aside, a piece of evidence in a long argument about the history of the concept of an origin. Without that act of preservation, carried out in the 6th century of the Common Era by a man who was himself working within a tradition, Anaximander helped to start, the sentence would be lost entirely. What survives is what survived by accident or by the patience of someone who thought it worth keeping, and there is something appropriate about that, something that rhymes quietly with the idea the sentence itself contains. Things perish back into what they came from, but some things, not all things, linger. The word that most requires attention, the word that has occupied philosophers and scholars for generations, is dike. It is usually translated as justice. In the ordinary Greek of Anaximander's time, it carried the weight of a legal proceeding, a rightful claim, a proper settlement, the disposition of a court that has heard both sides and returned each thing to its proper place. Anaximander borrowed it entire, the civic and moral word, and placed it at the center of a sentence about the cosmos, not about how human beings should treat one another, about how the universe itself is organized, how it settles its debts, how the fact of being something particular and bounded and temporary is framed, under his account, as a kind of overreach for which a reckoning eventually arrives. The word was not chosen carelessly. A man who wrote in prose, who chose each word against the alternative of not choosing it, who was composing in a period when prose itself was a philosophical act, that man did not reach for the vocabulary of the law courts by accident. He reached for it because it was the vocabulary his culture already possessed for the idea of things being restored to their right proportion after a period of excess. The fragment names three things together: necessity, penalty, and retribution, and the assessment of time. Each one deserves its own moment of attention, held unhurriedly in the way Anaximander himself seems to have held the ideas before he wrote them down. Necessity first. The Greek word is kraion, and it carries a sense closer to that which must be than to anything as blunt as force. It is not compulsion from outside, not a law enforced by a court or a god, but something more intimate than that, the quality of being genuinely unavoidable, the character of a process that runs not because it is pushed, but because it has no alternative. Summer becomes autumn, not because autumn compels it, but because the persistence of summer would require something that the structure of things simply does not permit. Necessity, in Anaximander's sense, is not a cage. It is more like the shape of a container, not oppressive, simply determinative of what can and cannot remain inside it without eventually overflowing, and what overflows, everything, every determinate thing, every bounded and specific and named portion of reality, overflows its own temporary form, eventually, and is returned to the source. The cedar plank of a ship becomes the sea again, slowly, over years. The heat of a summer afternoon disperses into the long cool of autumn nights. A living body, assembled across decades into a particular arrangement of warmth and moisture and motion, eventually releases that arrangement back into the elements it borrowed from. None of this is unusual. None of it is even in the ordinary sense sad. It is simply what happens according to necessity, and Anaximander's achievement was to notice that the happening followed a pattern sufficiently general that it applied to everything at once, and to name the pattern with the calm precision of someone who had been watching it long enough to feel no urgency about it. Penalty and retribution are the harder words, the ones that have given the fragment its particular philosophical weight across the centuries. Poiné and thesis in the Greek, both words from the domain of legal settlement, both carrying the sense of a debt acknowledged and discharged. But what debt, and owed to whom? Anaximander does not say that individual things are guilty of something in the way a person in a law court is guilty, as though the summer deliberately wronged the winter, as though a living creature chose to exist at the expense of the elements it consumed. The injustice he describes is more structural than that, more ontological. To exist as something particular, to be this and not that, bounded and specific and edged, is already, in some sense, to have asserted a temporary priority over the unlimited whole. The unlimited whole is what Anaximander called the apeiron, the boundless, the source from which all determinate things emerge. And any determinate thing, by the very fact of its determination, has momentarily contracted the boundless into a specific form, pressed the unlimited into a shape, insisted on a distinction that the source itself does not make. That insistence is what the fragment calls injustice, and the return of each thing to the source is what discharges it. This is not a moral judgment in the ordinary sense. Anaximander was not saying that it is wrong to exist, that living creatures are culpable for their lives, that the summer is wicked for being warm. He was describing a structure, the way that every specific, every bounded thing, every form that the boundless takes on in the process of becoming a world, holds a temporary claim against the unlimited from which it came, and how the universe settles that claim through the patient operation of time. The language is the language of a law court, but the proceeding it describes is cosmological. It takes place at the level of elements and seasons and worlds, not at the level of individuals making choices. Nietzsche read Anaximander in an essay he never finished, written in the early years of his philosophical career, and he was struck by what he called the honesty of the position. In Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, he described Anaximander as a thinker who looked at the transience of all things without flinching, who saw in the perishing of everything, particular not a failure or a tragedy, but simply the truth, the way things are, stated plainly, without the softening that consolation would require. Nietzsche admired the absence of evasion in it. Anaximander had not looked away. He had not constructed a system in which the perishing of particular things is secretly part of a larger victory, in which the individual form is redeemed by its contribution to something permanent. He had simply said, things arise, they exist for a time, and they return, and the returning is as natural and as necessary as the arising, and both together are simply what the cosmos does. Nietzsche called this honest in a specific and technical sense, honest not as a virtue, but as a philosophical achievement, the willingness to hold a conclusion that offers no comfort and report it anyway. That reading is worth holding alongside the fragment itself, not because Nietzsche settles the question of what Anaximander meant, but because the encounter between a 19th century philosopher and a 6th century BCE fragment illuminates something about the fragment's character. It has been possible, across very different historical and intellectual climates, to find in it not despair, but something closer to clarity. The perishing of things held at sufficient philosophical distance, and Anaximander seems to have held it at exactly that distance, becomes less threatening and more simply accurate, less a wound and more a description, less the occasion for grief and more the occasion for the particular kind of calm that comes from recognizing the shape of what cannot be otherwise. A season yielding to the next carries this quality when observed without resistance. Summer does not surrender, it pays what it owes. The warmth that spread across the fields and the hills during the long bright months was never entirely summer's own to keep. It was held in trust, borrowed from a process larger than any one season, and when the time of its keeping comes to an end, the heat returns to the general circulation of the world's energies, dispersed into the cooling nights, absorbed into the ground, sent up as moisture into clouds that will carry it to some other season in some other form. There is no mourning in the process itself. The mourning is a feature of the observer, and even the observer, held within Anaximander's frame, is eventually a participant in the same transaction, a temporary particular, warm and bounded and specific, holding its form for a time and returning it when the assessment of time finds the account complete. The assessment of time, that phrase is the final movement of the fragment, and it is the one most resistant to complete translation. The Greek is to you, chronotaxis, the ordering or arrangement of time, time's own disposition of the matter, not a deadline imposed from outside, not a judge descending to deliver a verdict. Time itself, in Anaximander's formulation, is the assessor, patient, impersonal, utterly without preference for any particular outcome. It does not hurry the summer toward autumn. It does not spare the living creature its eventual dissolution. It does not exempt any form, however beautiful or intricate or useful, from the general accounting. It simply continues, and in continuing it arranges all things according to the necessity of their proportion, giving each form the duration that its nature and the nature of the whole allow, and then receiving it back without ceremony. There is a long tradition of asking whether this makes Anaximander a pessimist, a cosmic moralist, or something else entirely, a naturalist who borrowed moral vocabulary to describe a natural process because no purely natural vocabulary yet existed for what he was trying to say. The question has not been resolved, and the reason it has not been resolved is that the surviving evidence cannot settle it. What can be said is that the fragment reads, in its original form and in careful translation, as something other than pessimism. Pessimism requires a standard against which the world is found wanting. Anaximander's fragment does not offer a standard, it offers a description. Things perish back into what they came from, according to necessity, and pay penalty and retribution for their injustice, according to the assessment of time. The cosmos settles its accounts. This is not a complaint about the cosmos, albeit it is an account of how the cosmos works, set down in the most precise vocabulary the 6th century BCE had available for the idea of a balance being maintained. The fragment's use of legal vocabulary, penalty, retribution, assessment, points towards something philosophically important about the moment in which Anaximander was writing. The idea of an ordered cosmos, governed by principles analogous to those that governed a well-ordered city, was not yet available as a philosophical commonplace. Anaximander was among the first to reach for it, and the vocabulary he found for it was the vocabulary of civic life, of the agora, of the settlements reached in disputes between citizens before a body of judgment. He took the concept of dike, which belonged to human communities, to the resolution of conflicts between persons and factions, and extended it upward and outward into the structure of nature itself. In doing so, he made a claim that would echo through the whole subsequent tradition, that the cosmos is not arbitrary, that it is not at the mercy of divine caprice, that it operates according to something like principle, something like proportion, something that, if not identical to justice, at least moves in the direction that justice moves. This is the context in which the fragment becomes not just philosophically interesting, but philosophically generous. Anaximander was offering, in the earliest philosophical prose the Western tradition has preserved, a way of understanding the transience of things that does not require those things to be victims of an indifferent universe. The universe, under his account, is not indifferent in the way a void is indifferent, blank and purposeless and cold. It is indifferent in the way a well-functioning process is indifferent. It does not favor particular outcomes, but it does maintain its proportions. The summer is not punished. The living creature is not condemned. Each form is given what time allows it, and when what time allows it runs through, the form returns to the source, and the source continues without interruption, and the process begins again somewhere else in the boundless, producing another temporary world, another arrangement of warm and cool, another cycle of forms arising and returning, each one paying its debt, and each one making way for the next. The debt that all things owe is not, in this light, a burden imposed from outside. It is more like the structural condition of being a determinate thing at all, to be specific, to be this and not that, here and not there, now and not then, is to have borrowed a form from the boundless. The form is not permanent. It cannot be, because the boundless that generated it is not itself a form, and cannot permanently accommodate the forms it produces without eventually recalling them. The life of any particular thing is the time of its loan. The return is the natural end of the loan, not a foreclosure, not a punishment, not an injustice done to the particular by the whole. The injustice in Anaximander's usage runs the other way. It is the temporary excess of the particular over the boundless, the insistence of a form on remaining a form for as long as necessity permits, and the return is the settlement of that excess. Sitting with this long enough, in the way that serious philosophical thought invites one to sit with difficult ideas until they begin to feel like furniture rather than obstacles, something opens in it. The initial strangeness of the legal vocabulary fades. What remains is a picture of the world organized not by conflict, not by a cosmos at war with its own contents, but by something more like an ongoing and self-regulating equilibrium. Forms arise, forms persist for their allotted time, forms return, the source is undiminished, and the process continues. The assessment of time is patient in both directions. It does not rush the returning, any more than it rushed the arising. It waits for the natural completion of each cycle, and when the cycle completes, it registers the completion without drama and allows the next arising to begin. Anaximander wrote in a city where the language of law courts and civic settlements was alive and immediate, where dike was not an abstraction but a daily practice, the mechanism by which a prosperous and complex trading community maintained its proportions and resolved its conflicts. He would have known what it felt like for a debt to be discharged, for an imbalance to be corrected, for a claim to be heard and settled, and for both parties to leave the proceeding restored to their proper standing. That feeling, the feeling of an account closed, a balance restored, a claim resolved, is the feeling he imported into his description of the cosmos. The cosmos closes its accounts. The cosmos restores its balance. The forms that arose return, and the balance is maintained, and the boundless source from which everything came is neither depleted by what it generates, nor overwhelmed by what returns to it. There is a quality of rest in this, once the initial unfamiliarity of the vocabulary is released. Not the rest of indifference, not the rest of a mind that has stopped caring, the rest of a mind that has followed an idea far enough to see its proportions clearly, and found that the proportions, while they do not offer consolation in the ordinary sense, offer something steadier than consolation. They offer accuracy, and accuracy, held quietly and without demand, can become a kind of peace. And Anaximander did not write the fragment as comfort. He wrote it as philosophy, which in his moment and his city meant the honest attempt to describe the structure of reality without appealing to gods, without dressing the explanation in the robes of mythology, without borrowing authority from tradition or verse. He wrote it as a man who had looked at the arising and perishing of all things, and had found, in that looking, not despair and not transcendence, but the quieter and more durable thing that lies between them, the recognition of a pattern large enough and patient enough to accommodate everything, including the perishing of the recognizer. A living creature completing its life and returning its materials to the earth and air is doing exactly what Anaximander's fragment describes. The warmth disperses, the moisture joins the general circulation of water through the world. The specific arrangement of elements that constituted a particular form, a particular warmth, a particular weight, a particular set of capacities, releases its grip on that arrangement, and allows each element to return to the larger pool from which it was drawn. There is no remainder. Nothing is wasted. The elements do not mourn the form they composed, and the form does not persist by clinging to the elements. The account is closed, the assessment is complete, and the boundless source, undiminished and untroubled, continues its quiet and perpetual work of producing the next arising. This is not a small idea. It is arguably one of the oldest and most carefully considered answers to the question that living things, encountering the fact of their own transience, have always had occasion to ask, not why must things end, which is not a question with an answer available to philosophy, but what is the character of the ending? What does the returning mean? Whether the dissolution of a particular form into the general source constitutes a loss that requires grief, or a completion that permits something quieter than grief. Anaximander, in the 6th century BCE, in a prosperous harbor city on the western coast of what is now Turkey, writing in prose at a time when prose was itself a philosophical act, gave an answer. The ending is a settlement. The returning is a payment. The accounting is conducted by time, patiently and without preference, and when the account is complete, it is simply complete, and the boundless receives back what it gave out, and neither the giving nor the receiving disturbs its fundamental nature. The fragment read very slowly, in the order Anaximander placed its phrases, has the quality of a careful argument arriving at a rest. Things perish back into that from which they came. This is the basic structural claim, the observation that dissolution is directional, that what returns goes back to the source rather than simply dispersing into nothing. According to necessity, not according to accident, not according to a God's decision, but according to the inherent structure of what determinate things are and what the boundless is. And they pay penalty and retribution to one another, the reciprocity of the process, the way that the temporary dominance of one form over another is balanced by the eventual yielding of each form back to the neutral ground beneath all forms. For their injustice, the structural overreach of being something specific in a source that is not specific, the temporary priority that any bounded thing asserts simply by being bounded. According to the assessment of time, the patience of the process, the way the cosmic accounting is conducted, not in haste, but in the full measure of whatever duration each form's nature and the nature of the whole allow. Each phrase adds something. None of them is decoration. The sentence, for all its compression, it is not a long sentence, even in Greek, is doing a great deal of philosophical work, and the work it is doing has occupied thinkers for centuries without being fully discharged, which is itself a kind of testimony to the quality of the thinking. Nietzsche noticed the honesty of it, and that noticing was his contribution, the recognition that a thinker willing to say what Anaximander said, without softening it, without building a consolation into the structure, was doing something philosophically rare and philosophically serious. But the honesty Nietzsche admired does not have to be read as tragic. It can be read as simply clear. The clarity of a mind that has watched the arising and perishing of everything long enough that the watching no longer produces urgency, only attention. Attention, sustained long enough, becomes a kind of companionship with the world as it actually is. Time as assessor, that image carries the weight of the fragment's final phrase and deserves its own moment of quiet attention before the fragment is set down. Time, in Anaximander's formulation, is not the medium in which events happen, the container that holds them while they occur. It is something more active than that, something more like the organizing principle of the whole process, the patient intelligence, if intelligence is not too strong a word, by which the cosmic accounting is maintained. Time does not favor the summer over the winter, or the winter over the summer. It gives each its duration, receives back what each form owes, and continues without preference or interruption. It does not hurry the living creature toward its dissolution or extend its duration beyond what the structure of things allows. It simply continues, and in continuing it arranges all things in their proper proportion, and the proportion is maintained across the full span of what has arisen and what has returned from the first differentiation of the boundless into warm and cool, all the way through every season and every form and every world that has arisen within the apeiron's endless patience. That patience is the deepest quality of Anaximander's cosmos, not the patience of waiting for something to arrive, but the patience of something that has always already been sufficient to itself, that needs no outcome, no resolution, no final state in which all accounts are permanently balanced, because the balancing is ongoing and is itself the nature of the process. The boundless does not wait for all things to return before it is complete. It is complete in every moment of the arising and returning, both movements equally belonging to its nature, neither one a departure from it, and neither one a return to it. The arising and the returning are both expressions of what the boundless is, a source that produces forms and receives them back indefinitely and without loss, in a city that told its deepest stories in verse, through gods who intervened in the world with their desires and their jealousies and their preferences. Anaximander chose prose. He chose the language of the agora, the vocabulary of settlement and balance, and he aimed it at the cosmos as a whole. The gods were not invited into the description. Necessity was there, and time, and the structural condition of being something bounded in a source that has no bounds. These were enough. They are, under careful attention, more than enough. They produce a picture of the world that has held its shape across 25 centuries of philosophical examination, not because it is comforting and not because it is complete, but because it is honest in the specific and difficult way that philosophical honesty requires. It says what can be said. It does not say more than can be said, and it holds the saying with exactly the patience it is describing. The fragment rests now, as it has rested through the centuries, making no demands. Things perish back into that from which they came, according to necessity, and pay penalty and retribution to one another for their injustice, according to the assessment of time. The assessor is patient. Whatever must return will return in its own time, in the full measure of that time, and the boundless from which all things came will receive it without urgency and without ceremony, as it has received everything that has ever returned to it, and will receive everything that is yet to return, which is, in the end, all things, held now in their temporary forms, at the particular moment in the assessment when their duration is still running. Anaximander pressed the tip of his instrument into the surface before him, and a line appeared. It was a small thing, a mark, a beginning, but it carried inside it something that had not existed in quite this form before, the idea that the whole known world could be held in a single shape, drawn from a single overhead point of view, arranged not by the stories gods had left behind them, but by the careful, patient observation of a mind that had decided to look. The room was in Miletus. The time was sometime in the 6th century BCE. Outside, the harbor would have been going about its ordinary business, the loading and unloading of ships, the exchange of goods between people who had traveled from different edges of the known world, and none of it would have looked, from the outside, like the moment when the world first began to understand itself as a geometry. He drew coastlines. He placed land masses in relation to one another. He sketched what he knew of the routes that traders and sailors had returned from, and he arranged those routes not as a sequence of stories, but as a spatial whole, a shape in which distance was real, and proportion mattered, and the earth held still long enough to be seen from above. The map was not perfect. No map of that period could have been, but the ambition inside it, the ambition to replace the mythological arrangement of the world with a rational one, to treat the inhabited earth as something that could be known rather than merely told, that ambition was something the world had not clearly articulated before. There is a particular kind of confidence required to make a map, not the confidence of someone who already knows the answers, but the confidence of someone willing to commit a shape to a surface and let it be wrong in ways that can be corrected. Anaximander had that confidence. He had already applied it to questions no map could hold, to the question of what the world was made of, to the question of where all things came from, to the question of what the sky was doing above the city at night. Now he applied it to the visible world itself, pressing a line into a surface and beginning the long project of drawing the earth as it actually was. Later sources would remember him for this. Strabo and Diogenes Laertius both recorded the tradition that he had made this first map. They could not have known all of what the making of it meant, what it required of a mind to step outside the inherited ways of knowing and offer something cooler, more geometrical, more committed to the plain evidence of observation, but they preserved the fact of it, and the fact is enough. Somewhere in Miletus, in the 6th century BCE, a man bent over a surface and drew the world, and in doing so he was doing the same thing he had done when he named the apeiron, and the same thing he had done when he described the earth as a drum suspended in equilibrium at the center of everything. He was insisting that the world could be known without recourse to anything beyond the world itself. There is something quietly startling in the range of what Anaximander turned his attention toward. The origin of all things, the structure of the cosmos, the nature of the Earth's position in space, the mechanics of the sky, the shape of the inhabited world, and then, in a direction the rest of his cosmology might not obviously have led, the question of where human beings themselves had come from. He considered the newborn. He looked at how helpless a human infant is, how unlike a young animal, how dependent, how incapable for years of sustaining itself alone. And then he thought about what the earliest conditions of the world must have been like. Harsher, more raw, more violent in the elemental sense than the world as it existed in his own time. He asked a question that no one in the Greek tradition seems to have asked quite this way before. If the earliest world was as difficult as the evidence suggested, how could human beings who require such extended care and shelter simply to survive their own infancy have survived at all in those original conditions? The answer he arrived at was that they had not quite been human, not in the beginning. Something had come before the human form, something better suited to the harsher early world, something that could sustain itself in conditions that would have been fatal to a newborn child. He pointed toward the sea. He pointed toward creatures that lived in water, fish-like forms that required far less from their environment, that could sustain themselves without the long period of protected dependence that human infants require. Human beings, he seems to have proposed, descended from earlier aquatic creatures. They had been carried forward from the sea into the land, from the earlier form into the later one, from the harsher world into the somewhat gentler world that had since developed. This was not Darwin. The mechanisms are entirely different, and the evidence Anaximander was working with was thin by any later standard. But the philosophical gesture, the insistence that human beings must be located inside a natural history rather than outside it, that our form is not original but derived, that the world came first, and we arrived within it as one development among many. That gesture is genuinely extraordinary for its time. It placed humanity inside the cosmos rather than above it. It made the human form one answer among many that the world had tried, one temporary differentiation within the long process that the apeiron had been producing all along. Ancient sources report that he may have pointed to fossil evidence, to the remains of sea creatures found in places far from the present sea, as part of what suggested to him that the land had once been underwater, and that the forms of life that existed now had not always existed in the forms they currently held. Whether or not this reconstruction of his reasoning is accurate, the direction of thought is consistent with everything else he did. Look at what is actually present, follow the evidence as far as it goes, and do not stop following it, simply because where it leads is strange. He looked at a storm the same way. Thunder was not the expression of a divine mood. Lightning was not a message. When compressed air broke out of a cloud, it made the sound of thunder. When a cloud split, the flash of its breaking appeared in the sky. These were physical events, pressures releasing, materials behaving as materials behave, and a mind committed to naturalistic explanation had no reason to call them anything other than what they were. The storm continued exactly as it always had, neither diminished nor deprived of its power by the explanation. What changed was only the story surrounding it, the frame through which a mind looking at the sky chose to understand what it saw. This methodological commitment, the willingness to look at thunder and lightning and wind and refuse to install a god at the source, was not a small thing in the intellectual climate of 6th century Greece. It was a discipline, a chosen way of proceeding. It required the willingness to offer an account that carried no narrative comfort, that appealed to no story already known, that asked the listener to accept an explanation that was dry and impersonal and made no one feel either threatened or protected. Anaximander offered those explanations anyway. He seems to have believed that a true account of the world was more valuable than a comforting one, and that the two could usually be told apart by how they handled the actual evidence. Much later, in the 20th century, a philosopher working in a very different tradition would sit down with the ancient sources on Anaximander and recognize in what he found there a familiar intellectual shape. Karl Popper had spent a long portion of his career trying to describe what made genuine scientific thinking different from other kinds of thinking, and the answer he had arrived at centered on criticism, on the willingness of a mind to take an inherited position, expose its inadequacies, and offer something harder, stranger, and more honestly reasoned in its place. When he looked at Anaximander's relationship to Thales, he found exactly this structure. Thales had proposed water. Anaximander had looked at the proposal, found it insufficient, found that any determinate substance, if made primary, would by its own nature overwhelm everything unlike itself, and offered something that no one had yet named, something that could not be seen or touched or cupped in the hands, something that escaped every particular quality and every particular limit. Popper called this the critical conjectural method, and he argued that Anaximander had demonstrated it before anyone in the Western tradition had articulated it as a method at all. The willingness to subject a received answer to rational criticism and replace it with a bolder, more abstract alternative. This was, in Popper's view, the signature of a genuinely scientific mind, and it appeared in Miletus in the 6th century BCE, in the specific intellectual transaction between a teacher and a student. in the moment when Anaximander looked at the word water and found it too small. What Popper was pointing at was not merely the content of Anaximander's thought, but its structure, the way the thought moved, the direction in which it was willing to travel, the absence of deference to tradition that made possible the move from the inherited answer to the harder, more honest one. This structure persists. It does not belong only to Miletus or to the 6th century. It is the same structure that carries any genuine inquiry forward. The question held without premature closure, the received answer examined rather than accepted, the willingness to arrive somewhere unexpected and stay there long enough to see what it is. At the other end of history, or rather at the end that is visible from here, a different kind of thinker would arrive at something that rhymes with what Anaximander described. Contemporary physics has, in the course of the 20th century, developed accounts of physical reality that have no obvious analog in the ordinary world of objects. The quantum vacuum is one of these. It is not empty space in the ordinary sense. It is a formless, fluctuating medium, a ground of potentiality, seething at the smallest scale, with virtual formations that arise and dissolve, with fields that have no definite configuration until something forces them to take one. Carlo Rovelli, among others, has drawn the comparison carefully and without overreach. The apeiron and the quantum vacuum are not the same thing. Anaximander was not doing physics, and the comparison proves nothing in either direction. But there is a structural resemblance that is worth sitting with, the idea of a formless, generative ground from which determinate things arise through some process of differentiation, into which they return when the conditions that sustain their particular form no longer hold. Anaximander arrived at this idea through philosophical reasoning, through the internal logic of a single question taken seriously over the course of a life. Physics arrived at something structurally similar through mathematics and experiment across many lives and many generations. What this resemblance suggests is not that Anaximander was secretly right in some technical sense, or that the ancient philosophical tradition was pointing toward modern physics. What it suggests is something quieter, that the philosophical intuition of an indeterminate origin, an origin that cannot itself be one of the things it gives rise to, that must be in some sense prior to and neutral with respect to all the particular forms that emerge from it, is a recurring and perhaps indispensable structure in the deepest accounts of what reality is. When thinking is pushed far enough, in different centuries, by different methods for different reasons, it tends to encounter something like this: a ground that has no particular form, a source that is itself not one of the things it sources, an origin whose nature is precisely to exceed every determination it makes possible. Anaximander gave this thing a name. He called it the apeiron, the boundless, the without limit, and in naming it, he was not so much describing a thing as pointing at a region where description runs out and something else begins. The name was not a solution. It was a kind of honest marking, a way of indicating that the question of origins had been taken as far as determinate language could take it, and that what lay beyond that point was not ignorance, but a genuine philosophical understanding of why the question had to stop there. The fragment that survives, that single ancient sentence preserved by Simplicius in his commentary on Aristotle's physics, reaches toward the same region from a different angle. Things return to the source from which they came, paying penalty and retribution according to the assessment of time. The language of the law court appears here: penalty, retribution, assessment. But it is doing philosophical work, not civic work. It is naming something real about the structure of existence, that the particular forms the world takes are temporary, that their particularity is a kind of excess over the ground, that produce them, and that the ground will, in time, receive them back. Time does the assessing. Not a god, not a judge, not a will of any kind, but time itself, patient and impersonal, measuring out the interval during which each form holds its particular shape before it returns. Summer holds its heat for its season, and then yields. A living thing holds its particular organization for its particular span, and then releases. A world holds its structure for however long the apeiron allows, and then dissolves back into the boundless. The assessment is already underway, always, for everything. It does not hurry. It does not relent. It simply continues, the way time continues, the way the apeiron continues, without edge and without end. There is a quality of philosophical attention in Anaximander's thought that is difficult to name but easy to feel once it has been noticed. It is the attention of a mind that has genuinely looked at existence without flinching, not without wonder, but without the flinch that comes from needing existence to be other than it is. He looked at the multiplicity of things and did not need it to be reducible to something simple. He looked at the transience of things and did not need it to be other than transient. He looked at the cosmos and did not need it to have been made for any particular purpose, or to be tended by any particular power, or to arrive at any particular destination. What he found, under all of this patient, unflinching attention, was the apeiron, the ground that holds all of it, that produces all of it, that receives all of it back without loss, because from the perspective of the boundless, nothing is ever truly lost. The particular forms arise and dissolve. The operand continues. Whatever was held in a particular form returns to the source and is held there in the undifferentiated whole, no longer distinguishable, but no longer needing to be distinguished. This is a thought that has a specific quality when held seriously and without alarm. It does not feel like defeat. It feels from the inside more like the discovery of a very large and very stable room, larger than any particular thing in it, older than anything it currently contains, indifferent to the specific arrangements it sustains without being hostile to them. The individual formations arise within the ape or in the way furniture exists within a room. The room does not need the furniture to be what it is, but it holds the furniture easily, without effort, and the furniture's presence neither adds to nor subtracts from the room's essential nature. Anaximander lived in Miletus, and walked its streets, and looked at its harbor, and observed its sky, and thought over the course of decades about what all of this was made of, and where it came from. He drew a map. He wrote a treatise in prose. He described the earth as a cylinder hanging in equilibrium. He placed the stars in rings of fire. He proposed that human beings had come from the sea. He said that all things return to the source, according to necessity, paying what they owe to the assessment of time. And then he was gone. Not dramatically, not with any record of a final conversation or a last thought set down. Simply gone, as all particular things go, return to the boundless in whatever way the apeiron arranges the return. What he left behind was a fragment, a tradition, a set of questions that his student Anaximenes would inherit and push further, and a name, apeiron, that pointed at something his language could not quite hold. The fragment has survived for more than 2,500 years. It has been copied and recopied, translated and retranslated, commented on by Simplicius and puzzled over by Nietzsche, and held up by Popper as an early model of scientific thinking, and examined by Ravelli for its unexpected resonance with the physics of the 20th century. Each of these encounters is a kind of testimony, not to the fragment's authority, but to something in the philosophical gesture it preserves, something that each of these very different minds in very different centuries found themselves unable to simply pass by. The gesture is this: a thinker looks at the origin of all things and refuses to resolve the question prematurely, refuses to name a substance already known, refuses to let the comfort of a familiar answer close down the inquiry before the inquiry has found its true depth. The thinker stays with the difficulty, not because the difficulty is pleasant, but because the truth at that depth is more valuable than the comfort of a premature resolution. And eventually, after enough honest staying, something appears. Not an answer in the ordinary sense, something more like the shape of the question itself, clearly seen, an open expanse with no edges, a ground with no bottom, a source with no name that is not immediately also too small. This is the apeiron. This is what Anaximander found. In the long centuries after Miletus, philosophers would return to this region again and again by different routes and under different names. They would call it different things. The one, the absolute being, the quantum vacuum, the ground of being, the formless prior to form. None of these names would quite hold what they were pointing at, because what they were pointing at exceeds every name. But the direction of the pointing would be consistent, away from the determinate, away from the particular, away from the bounded, toward whatever it is that has no edge, no quality, no limit that makes it this rather than that. Anaximander was among the first in the Western tradition to point this direction with philosophical precision, to give the pointing a name, and to follow the name with reasoning rather than myth. The reasoning has not ended, the pointing has not stopped. The tradition he helped begin is still going, still following the question into regions where language becomes approximate, and the best response is something close to silence. The silence is not empty. It is the silence of the apeiron itself, not the absence of content, but the presence of something that precedes every particular content, that makes every particular content possible, that waits on the other side of every determination, like the ocean on the other side of every wave. Waves arise and subside. The ocean continues. The wave was never separate from the ocean, not really, even when it held a shape and moved across the surface and caught the light in a particular way. The shape was temporary. The movement was temporary. The catching of light was temporary. The ocean was not. Anaximander might not have used this image. He was not given to images in the way later philosophers sometimes were. He preferred prose, argument, the careful placement of one reasoning step beside the next. But the logic of the image is his logic, the temporary arising of a determinate form from an indeterminate ground, the brief particularity of the formed thing, the return of the formed thing to the ground when its time has run, and the ground continuing unchanged as it was before the form arose, as it will be when all forms have returned. The map he drew is gone. The treatise he wrote has not survived. What remains is the fragment, the tradition, and the question, the open, patient, unhurried question of where all things begin, still turning in the same direction it has always turned, still finding that what it points at has no name small enough to hold it, and no edge that a thought can press against. In some laboratory, at this hour, someone is working with the mathematics of fields and vacuum states, following equations into regions where ordinary intuitions break down, where the distinction between something and nothing becomes difficult to maintain, where the formless seems to be constantly producing the formed and receiving it back without effort. They are not thinking of Anaximander. They may never have heard the name, but the structure of what they are describing, the indeterminate ground, the arising of determination from it, the return of the determined to the indeterminate, rhymes across 25 centuries with the structure of what he described from a room in Miletus with a stylus in his hand and a question he was willing to take all the way down. The apeiron does not require anyone to be thinking about it. It does not need to be named to continue doing what it does. It was not named for most of the time it has been doing it. Anaximander gave it a name in the 6th century BCE, and the name has helped. It has made the concept available, carryable, transmissible across generations. But the thing the name points at was there before the name and will be there when the name is no longer used. It is there now, beneath and around everything, in the dark and in the quiet, as patient as it has always been, holding all the particular forms that have arisen from it, the rooms, the cities, the continents, the sleeping bodies, the slowly breathing darkness, holding all of them the way the ocean holds its waves, without effort, without preference, without any need for the held things to know they are being held. Anaximander knew, or came as close to knowing as a human mind can come, that everything that is particular is also temporary, and that the temporary arises from and returns to something that is neither. He did not find this frightening. The fragment suggests he found it clarifying, a recognition of the actual structure of existence, impersonal and necessary and oddly peaceful, once the flinch had passed and the looking had gone all the way to the bottom. The bottom is not a bottom. That is the final thing his philosophy keeps saying. In the patient way a philosophical tradition says things, not loudly, not urgently, but steadily, across however many centuries are needed for the saying to be heard. No bottom, no edge, no name that is quite the right size. Only the apeiron, continuing its quiet, inexhaustible work, the same work it was doing before any particular thing arose from it, the same work it will be doing when all particular things have returned, producing, receiving, holding, not hurrying, not requiring anything of what it holds, except that, eventually, in its own time and according to its own necessity, it return. The ground beneath a sleeping body is steady. The darkness in a room at night has no particular edge